Now, I should say the lack of condemnation by Democrat politicians in America of what you've seen, and also similar outbreaks in violence and looting in New York, in Atlanta, in other cities, in Minneapolis, has been shocking. And it makes me wonder whether they are tacitly approving of the violence in a form of, I don't know, civil war against Donald Trump. I think they're playing with fire, literally. Wonder where this will go. Back to Australia. Now, I've got no sympathy really for billionaire Clive Palmer. In my opinion, has been a buffoon and a bit of a bully at times. He's bought his way to political influence with his Palmer United Party, and he was accused of trying to shortchange his workers when his nickel refinery went bust, and now he's been charged with fraud, and on the drama it goes. He says he's innocent, I should clarify. But I do think that Clive Palmer is the victim of something absolutely red hot, because it's another example, I'm afraid, of governments in this country getting far too full of themselves, far too authoritarian. Palmer wanted to build a mine in Western Australia. The state government stopped him. He sued, said they exceeded their powers. It was in a legally binding arbitration process with the WA government, and it looked like he'd win. So what does this McGowan Labor government do? It's now going to rush through an emergency law that kills Palmer's case, makes the illegal legal, and stops him from appealing to the courts. It is unbelievable.
He is trying to take our money, and if he's successful, that would mean mass closures of hospitals, of schools, of police stations.
You know, they must feel fairly guilty. The press should be saying, well, what's this about? What have you done? How have you possibly incurred $30 billion of damages for the state of Western Australia? Because you're the ones that have done it. I'm not saying it's $30 billion, they're saying it.
Joining me are Rita Panay, Sky News host and Herald Sun Star columnist, and Daniel Wild, Director of Research at the Institute of Public Affairs. Daniel, how can a government do this? I mean, avoid paying compensation for breaking the law by changing the law.
It's concerning, Andrew, and there's a lot of gamesmanship going on both sides of this equation, I'd have to say. But overall, Mark McGowan is coming across as a bit foolish and quite vindictive, I'd have to say. It's not unreasonable to say that perhaps what McGowan is doing is to get back at Clive Palmer for his legal challenge of the constitutionality of Western Australia's hard border closure, which is a completely legitimate undertaking from Clive Palmer. He's a citizen of this country, has every single right to be undertaking that line of inquiry, and he shouldn't be subject to what could be interpreted as intimidation, the use of state power to try to silence him, to stop him from undertaking that inquiry on such an important issue. I mean, in Western Australia, Andrew, there's only one active case of the coronavirus. And they've still got a hard border closure. They've still got impositions on people's liberties, their jobs, their livelihoods, their freedoms. And it's very important that we can have these discussions about the use of emergency powers, their legitimacy, which is entirely what Clive Palmer is doing in challenging the constitutionality of the state border closure, and to have things such as natural justice. They're proposing in the legislation, Section 12.2, to remove natural justice provisions of an Australian citizen, which means removing a protection against a biased trial, removing procedural fairness, removing the right to be heard. This should not be happening in Australia, Andrew. Whatever you think of Clive Palmer, he's an Australian citizen, and he should not be subject to these attacks.
If your theory is right, it makes it even worse that you are denying a man his legal rights in one area on the grounds that you don't like what he's doing in another. I mean, Rita Panahi, Clive Palmer saying he'll take it to the High Court. Are you bleeding for the man?
I'm certainly not bleeding for him, but I think in this case he's been treated terribly unfairly. To remove someone's legal rights and natural justice and to retrospectively apply these laws after a case has been brought that looks like he's winning. Where is due process? Where's the rule of law there? I mean, we look like a banana republic if that's how we're operating. But thankfully with Clive Palmer, I mean, the man is a billionaire, if not a billionaire, close to it. So he's got the means to take this to the High Court and to get justice, hopefully, at the end of it. For most people, though, if they were in his position, they would have to cop it. And again, that's not good enough. You should have a fair fight, whether you're going up against a state government or whether you're going up against your next door neighbour. You shouldn't have this unfair battle when one side can change the rules halfway through.
Absolutely not. And look, you're right. He's got the money to keep, to fight this. But on the other hand, it sends a terrible signal to any investors checking over Australia and Western Australia in particular. They risk their cash, and the rules get changed on them halfway through if the government doesn't like what's happening. I mean, fair dinkum.
And then to blame Clive Palmer for hospital closures or schools closing because they stuffed up. The guilt trip there is just pathetic, and you'd hope that West Australians can see through that. But I think it's going to be a popular line. People are going to get parochial
and that's why they're exaggerating the potential cost of the payout to $30 billion. It wouldn't be that, but that's what they're doing. They're frightening the public to make them accept. Another example of governments getting too tyrannical in the panic over the coronavirus. Daniel, briefly back to American politics. The polls say that Democrat Joe Biden is going to win the US election in November. Well, we'll see about that. And today he named his running mate, as predicted, California Senator Kamala Harris, although in telling her she was his choice, just have a look under Joe Biden's phone. You'll see a piece of paper there. He actually needed notes, apparently, to remind himself what to say to her. I guess that's how vague the bloke has now got. What does choosing Kamala Harris tell you?
Well, I love the way that this is, portrayed by the ABC and the Fairfax, or what was the Fairfax press, the Nine Entertainment press. Biden and Kamala Harris, they're the moderate, sensible, centrist Democrats that are going to get us over the Trump nightmare, over the coronavirus, over the protests. But there's no such thing as a moderate Democrat, Andrew. And the reason is that Kamala Harris was chosen not on her ability or her merit or her contribution, but because she's a woman of colour. That was the explicit reason why she's been chosen as a vice presidential candidate. And it shows just how far the Democratic Party is down the identity politics rabbit hole of, treating people based on their immutable characteristics rather than, the inherent dignity of the individual, which is the entire edifice of our entire, culture and civilization. And I think it's deeply concerning, this idea that, Biden and Harris represent the centrism. Maybe, their own personal dispositions are that way, but the power base of the Democratic Party is with Black Lives Matter, it's with radical climate change policies, and it's with this identity politics. And choosing Kamala Harris on that basis, I think, just further confirms that lurch.
Rita, what do you think? And I don't know, just tell me too, should I give up my attempt to pronounce her name like she says it should be pronounced and just go Kamala Harris instead?
It just sounds wrong, but apparently, yes, she says her name is pronounced Kamala. So I'm sure we'll get used to it by November 4.
Okay, yeah,
look,
good.
I think, she's a very well-credentialed VIP pick. Absolutely. I thought she was the front runner all the way, even though the polling didn't show that. She wasn't even doing that well in her home state of California. But I do kind of resent the fact that, though she's very well-credentialed, we all knew that the Biden camp were going to pick a woman, and most likely a woman of colour. So they already had those requirements there. Luckily, she fits them, but you do feel like they are ticking boxes, and she comes with a fair bit of baggage, though she's got a fairly illustrious career. There's all sorts of people amongst the Democrats themselves who are uncomfortable with some of her conduct, particularly putting people in jail for marijuana offences, for blocking evidence that would have freed a man who was who was on death row and he was innocent. So there are all these bits of baggage that the Republicans could use very skillfully, but it remains to be seen if we even have debates. Are we going to see Biden v. Trump? And I think we're more likely to see Pence versus Harris than we are Biden and Trump, because I think Biden's going to try to dodge those debates with everything he's got.
Well, let's see what happens, because we might be getting used to the pronunciation of a name a lot if Biden wins the election and he's 77 and he seems not in control of his faculties. It could soon be President Kamala Harris. Or Kamala, or whoever it is. I'll get used to it. Daniel, the Victorian opposition leader today called on the Victorian Premier to resign for incompetence and for not telling the truth about the management of Victoria's quarantine hotels and letting the virus escape, etc. Here he is.
This state government said they were going to take up ADF support on day one of the hotel quarantine program. So for the Premier to turn around yesterday and tell Parliament and tell Victorians that there was no support on offer is just completely false.
Daniel, I heard ABC presenters like Virginia Trioli, also outraged with this idea of asking the beloved Dan to resign. Are you outraged?
Yeah, the idea of having a debate, Andrew, the idea of having some opposition to all of the decisions that are being made at such an important time. It's good to see some pushback finally happening in Victoria, political pushback, but also pushback in the media, some more questions being answered. And what's important is we can actually have an open debate. We cannot lock down the state of Victoria or any other part of the country every single time there is a spike in cases. We need to have a better way of going forward. And the only way you can do that if there's a transparency, if there's honesty, if there's debate. There's a lot of different approaches to managing the coronavirus. You've been going on and making the important point, Andrew, since March. So there's better ways of managing the elderly, those with comorbidity factors, than what we're currently doing. There's many different approaches, and it's good to see some pushback. And this is not a political issue. This is to give the people of Victoria a choice. A debate,
but
a discussion,
he was being
an
actually
alternative.
chided for not getting on board. And you're thinking, how many of these bad decisions in the past several months that have unleashed this virus should the opposition have been supporting the ABC? I'm actually out of time, Rita, but I do need to ask you about this. Asking for the Premier to step down at a moment of crisis like this, is that a smart move?
Look, it might not be something that is, ever going to happen, but I think given the number of monumental stuff-ups in this state, the dishonesty that we have seen this week, I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to put out there, even though it's unlikely to ever happen. We do need a Royal Commission, though. We need to see a full investigation into the coronavirus response in this state, because there has been a catastrophe on a number of fronts, not just hotel quarantine.
Rita Panahi, Daniel Wild, thank you both so much for your time.